Well, hello, Ben Frederick here. Excited to bring another edition of the Ben Asks interview series, and particularly pleased to have a friend from a few years back, kind of on the workforce development side, working together in public policy. Dr. KB Stallworth is with me today, and we're going to talk about a lot of topics. I think this will definitely be a multi-part with his indulgence, a lot of things to go over, and just delighted to have him here. He is a self-stated public policy emeritus figure. Now he's had a lot of roles over the years since the inception of the Black Caucus Foundation of Michigan, but he continues to serve in an emeritus policy role with that foundation and the Michigan Legislative Black Caucus, as well as some enterprises in business and many other things. So KB, welcome, and just delighted to have you here.
Well, it's wonderful to be with you, Ben, and I appreciate the invitation.
Well, we're going to get right into this, and I love to kind of find out about a person's spark and share that with people. You've got a diverse background, diverse skill set in public policy and entrepreneurship and any number of different topics. But intertwined through that, family, clearly very important to you. Now, the Stallworth family overall has a rich legacy of service in Detroit. Can you give us an overview kind of what that was like for you as a child, how that legacy would have weighed on your shoulders growing up?
Well, you can see from the gray hairs that I'm past that middle age point. So as a child that had a chance literally to live through the socioeconomic and cultural changes of the 60s, I think that really was the other spark that ignited really a serious effort towards trying to understand and help resolve some of the challenges that urban America was facing. It is true that we come from a line of public servants and business persons. My father served as the Director of Internal Audit for the Michigan Department of Social Services for 32 years. And my mother served in the Michigan Legislature for 22 years. So that, if you want to know what those frequent dinner conversations were like around our table, needless to say, my brother and I got an earful from the time we were children all the way till we were young adults. Having that exposure of being a kid in elementary school and experiencing President Kennedy's death, experiencing Robert Kennedy's death, Martin Luther King's death, the Vietnam War, the great rebellion of 1967 in Detroit. I mean, for children that experience those things, I think our entire generation has a real focus on understanding the value of America and what it can provide, but also the challenges that are there for people that really don't have the opportunities. Early on, I was a staffer as an undergrad at Michigan State University for Congressman Robert Carr, who was the congressman out of East Lansing. Through that process and working with Bob, I met a young man that was very much involved in the restoration of Chrysler Corporation, a young congressman by the name of Jim Blanchard.
Yeah.
When I graduated from MSU, I took off and did a stint at Inland Steel, Time Magazine, and World Book. And when Jim ran and was successful for governor, he asked me to return. And I served as a deputy director of the Commerce Department, then did a stint over at the Michigan Lottery before I went into private enterprise. And so I've had a little bit of both. I mean, I think most people of this generation know me from my work in the legislature, but some of the old timers remember back in the 80s when a lot of the things that we hoped would move forward in terms of transitioning Michigan to a demand-based economy. I think we started them, but somehow we got off track.
Yeah, certainly. And so much, so much to go into there. Like I said, this will be a multi-parter. I'm feeling that for sure.
Well, let me say this, and and I'll fast forward through the remainder of the story. So I had the experience after working as the first state marketing executive of the Michigan Lottery. And I had the dubious distinction of being able to work to launch the 6 of 40 program at the Bureau. I then went in to co-found the first minority-owned commercial insurance brokerage with the former CEO and chairman of First Independence Bank, Don Davis. We had a very successful business, and through that work at Liberty Risk Management, one of our clients was the Detroit Edison Company, who was very interested in finding a vendor that they could collaborate with in an attempt to get local and diverse contractors and journeymen into electric line clearance and construction. I hadn't climbed a tree before, nor did I really know that much about distribution. So this was going to be a heavy ask, but I mean, I get excited sometimes about challenges. And with the support of then President John Lobia, who was president of Detroit Edison, we started on a 3 to 5 year experiment overseen by then the Vice President of Distribution, Ron May, that resulted in a line clearance and construction company, the only African-American owned one in the state, the first one in the country. And we had been on DTE's property, providing those services consistently every year since 1992. I've had the opportunity to work on 11 hurricanes across the country, providing restoration and construction services. And I want to say that the professionals and craftsmen that provide that work, one of the most dangerous jobs in America. I mean, people usually don't think about the work until they hit the switch and the lights don't come on.
Yeah.
But it's been a very rewarding experience, and we continue to try to figure out ways to link our public education system into highly skilled craft jobs like those of electric linemen.
You're exactly right. And we had, obviously we had that major ice storm a few years back that hit mid-Michigan particularly hard, and people started to learn some maybe what linemen even were. But as they learned, and the ones who already did know, there was a tremendous appreciation for them, as much a frontline worker as any that we would think about in these types of disaster scenarios. So I'm looking forward to talking to you in more depth about the apprenticeship ideas and vocational education as well. Getting into kind of more recent events, I wanted to talk to you a bit about race relations, which is obviously top of a lot of people's minds worldwide. The George Floyd killing sparked a worldwide movement, not an exaggeration, a worldwide movement, certainly national, advocating for equality, institutional reform, a broad range of reforms. Before we go into maybe some of your advice for the different voices out there, what was your general reaction personally to these events, and what are your overall hopes for the future?
Well, first of all, my deepest condolences and prayers to the Floyd family and the people of Minneapolis. I think like most Americans, I couldn't process it. When I saw the video, I didn't know what I was looking at.
Yeah.
I simply could not process either the actions of the officer or the verbal requests from those, on the sidewalk that were asking for some support and consideration. I couldn't process it. It took me a minute to really understand what I had seen. I mean, I will be honest with you. I mean, Black folks are not unaccustomed to being targeted by police. I mean, it's just something every Black father goes through, this thing that they have to sit down with their kids, but particularly their sons, and tell them, don't run at night. You know, make sure you don't have your hands in your pocket. If the police pull you over, make sure you have your hands visible. Don't move unless they ask you to. If you have a chance and you see the light shining, please get me and your mom on cell phone right away. I mean, these are things I'm sure most Americans don't have to do that Black fathers have to do, or we feel we have to do because of our own experience. I don't know anyone that hasn't had a negative experience, and I have family members, you know, that are officers. I mean, Spike Lee did a very, I think, kind film on a family member who was the first detective in Colorado Springs. And the reason I say it was kind to some because his experience with coworkers was not quite as nice as it was portrayed in the film. I have a cousin who's a lieutenant in the Detroit Police Department. And Detroit does not have the same problems, perhaps, that other communities do because of the kind of work that Mayor Young and those after them put out there to kind of change the composition and culture of the police department. Mistakes happen, but I think there is, you know, a real challenge that we have in America without not being able to acknowledge that we have seen what we saw or that we've heard what we hear. So let me say that again. America has difficulty accepting that they've seen what they saw.
Yeah.
In each and every one of these cases that have come up, there is always the discussion about you didn't see what happened before, you didn't see this angle, you don't understand. But fundamentally, I think what some Americans simply don't understand is that there is a fundamental difference in being policed versus having someone provide you with public safety. Let me say that again. It is completely different to have someone provide you with public safety than to have someone policing you. Mm-hmm. And so service is I think, one of the fundamental challenges. And for me, as a policy advisor, you know, it goes all the way back to understanding what full citizenship and the benefits of full citizenship are. I believe that if an officer sees you as a citizen, they're more apt to find it easier to de-escalate. They find it easier to serve you before they brutalize you. And I'll give you two extreme examples. The less extreme example is what happens on college campuses all the time. You have students that break out walls after being drunk off beer. They get into fights, they tear up furniture, they do all kinds of stuff. Public safety officers more than likely will come there, calm them down, and unless they overreact, they're gonna put them in the custody of somebody that hopefully will take care of them, calm them down, because they know that's someone's child that's at the university and perhaps is acting out. Another child that might be doing that might not be seen that way. And they end up being arrested and taken to jail. The analogy, the more harsh reality, and I happen to be a member of the African American Episcopal Church, is how can someone walk into a church, pray in a prayer meeting, kill a minister, kill a state senator, shoot the parishioners, and when the police arrive, they're not afraid of him. They just arrest him. Another man has allegedly a fake $20 bill or is selling single cigarettes, but they're so deadly that you kill them. Logic defies that unless the first person is seen as a citizen, is given the benefit of the doubt, and is arrested and retained for the judicial system, while the latter is not necessarily seen that way. It's an uncomfortable discussion. It's always been an uncomfortable discussion, thinking of Black people as property versus full citizens. Mm-hmm. It's not something that's easy to talk about, but nobody likes to be called a racist. You're a racist. Nobody likes that. I mean, no one would like to be tagged that way.
Right.
But I think what America has to grip with is that perceptions are shaped over time, biases are shaped over time, and the reality is, if a person is embarrassed or humiliated by serving someone, and I put serving in quotations, then sometimes it may be difficult for them not to exercise more authority than is necessary to prove they are not serving them. We're in authority over you. And that's a big thing that the police should, quite frankly, be resolving themselves. How do we serve and protect all citizens versus showing authority over others? And that's why this compliance issue is so, if you don't comply, you don't submit to my authority, I will punish you, brutalize you, and maybe kill you. Versus if I serve you, I expect for you to respond accordingly. You may use profanity, you may do all kinds of things, but I don't feel I'm entitled to brutalize you because you're a citizen. Mm-hmm. And I know that may really, really sound strange, Ben, but it really is that fundamental. You have to have the ability to respect people, provide them with dignity, the same that you would want in order to back up from situations. No reason to be emotional if you're not in danger. And so this thing about I felt endangered and the person is unarmed, the only thing that could have been the danger is the color of their skin. It's a horrible thing to have to acknowledge, but that's really where we are. I would never excuse poor behavior. I would never excuse someone insulting officers, being non-responsive. Those things just, it's like throwing lighter fluid on a fire. Right. They accelerate a problem.
Right.
But they aren't the cause of the problem.
You know, I'm glad for this conversation, and I hope that there are other conversations like this happening. I was able to watch a conversation between an African-American pastor and a white pastor, and it was pretty eye-opening. Kind of to your earlier point about engagements with law enforcement, the Black pastor, I can't remember if he was referencing his son or himself, but he said, in speaking to the white pastor's earlier story, I guess, that had happened outside of the interview, that he'd been stopped by the police speeding or something like that. And he said, I was listening to this conversation as an African American, and I was thinking the whole time, you always knew you were going home.
That's right.
And the Black pastor's 250 pounds, and he says, I'm as nice and polite, but I'm doing some of these things. You could be rude and you're still going home. I have no certainty that I'm going home. And it was the mindset that he had to convey also to his children. And so that kind of gets me to my next question. What is your advice for white Americans who do have an earnest desire to be supportive of African Americans and other minorities? I mean, there is a learning process happening here. What is your advice for those that do have an open mind and heart at this moment?
Yeah, well, Ben, I think what you're doing is a big part of it. I mean, we have to acknowledge you don't know what you don't know. And so all of us are suffering from a certain degree of ignorance associated with not being able to share our perceptions. So all of us have bias. So implicit bias exists. You'll never get rid of that. But what you can learn how to do is manage it. But the only way that happens is through having exchanges. I'll give you a great example. I have a very a good friend whose wife did not realize a simple thing like telling a African American like myself, "Oh, you speak so well." How patronizing that is. Well, why wouldn't I speak well? I have a family that is well educated. My grandparents were well educated. We've been professional. Why is that? Why would you feel compelled to tell an African American, "Oh, you speak so well"? Mm-hmm. Now, to her, she probably would consider that a compliment. She didn't mean any harm. Do you understand what I'm saying? I'll give you another example. Yeah. The mere fact that the media continuously says he's an unarmed black man. That's what you hear. An officer killed an unarmed black man. But I just want you to think about this. If he had been armed, does that mean that justifies him being killed? I just want you to think about this. It presumes that if a black man is armed, I guess we could understand that better. If he was armed, we could understand why he was dead if he was armed. The bias is so deep that it predisposes that if an African American is armed, we understand that police will shoot them. And I don't believe most of America really is even sensitized to that. Any officer that takes someone's life, it should be for a very good reason. If you talk to officers, they'll tell you that. Most officers don't have to fire a weapon through their whole career, unless it's at the gun range, because that's not how they've been trained. And in today's society with technology, if a situation is really volatile, it's not like they're going anywhere. You can wait till they go home, you can do something else and pick them up the next day. And officers will tell you that all the time. If you are attacked, that's completely different. Any person has to protect themselves, protect the public. But we know that taking people's lives, it's tough. I'll mention this too, because I know some of your viewers may ask this question. Well, if the Black community is so concerned about Black life, why is there so much Black on Black crime? And why isn't there an outrage about Blacks killing Blacks? And that's a legitimate question. But what I would say to them is, what it ignores is that any group of people placed in a small geographic area with limited resources will display, some of them, predatory behavior. Anybody. If people do not have the basic necessities to take care of themselves and their family, that will spur a reaction to negative behavior. Not an excuse. It's just a reality associated with the predatory nature that comes with poverty. Homeless people take from each other. Not because they don't like other homeless people, but if you have a pair of shoes and I don't, I could be a very good person, but not all of us are Christ-like that way. And so our society has to accept some very real issues. All of these things fall hand in hand. You can't expect to put liquor stores on every corner in an urban community and not expect people to drink alcohol, or throw up tobacco signs on every corner and expect people not to, buy cigarettes. I'm fortunate to live in a gated, affluent community. I know the difference between public safety. If I have a little bit too much libation, one of the officers will drive me home. They will not arrest me. There's just a difference because the community is small. They are interested in people maintaining a quality of life, but more importantly, they serve the taxpayers that pay them. It's just a fundamental behavior that we don't like to acknowledge these things, Ben.
Mm.
The colleagues that serve with me in the legislature, I used to bring them all down to Detroit. And if you meet any of my old colleagues, they'll tell you I would even find a host families to put them up over the weekend. And the reason we did that, and we would go up north or to West Michigan too, but the reason we did that is that when you spend time with people, you know what your differences are, but you do have a better understanding of what they're grappling with. And you find out you have more in common than you have that are different. You know, we're all trying to raise our families, have a decent place to live, work, play. We all have the same aspirational goals for our children. It's just some of us have to go at it a little bit differently just based on environment. And so what I would say is one of the most important things, Ben, is just taking time, one, to talk to somebody that's different from you, and two, go out of your way just to be a nicer human being. I mean, if each one of us did that, the government wouldn't have to solve this.
Isn't that the truth? How much have we seen that really is just a fill-in for a real relationship between people?
And you don't have to, you don't have to agree on everything. Athletes know this. You can have the worst rivalries in the world, but that doesn't mean that after the game is over, you can't go back and look at the replays, critique it, and have a little fun in the process. I mean, this thing that we're in where our differences, turn into hate, we all have to get past that. There's a lot of pain out there. It is an excruciating thing to witness what I would consider lynchings. It's even more excruciating when you have minor children that you have to explain all this to. So I not only have a 2-year-old, but I have a 10-year-old and a 14-year-old here at home. Got a son who's up at Michigan State, but my son understands it. But my kids, they have a very difficult time, understanding why it remains this way. And by the time you go through the history lesson, and for us, meaning an African American has to go through the history lesson without creating additional trauma. So how do you describe all of the injustices that have occurred in our history without making them feel as if they're inferior? How do you do that? And trust me, brother, it is a long and excruciating conversation to deal with that.
Right. Yeah. That's a great point. And it's, when you talk about fathers talking to sons, I feel a certain affinity because my son is autistic and he's black and white literal, and so I have to be absolutely crystal clear and descriptive and just matter of fact in what I describe to him as far as his social encounters. And it's amazing how when you strip away the social nuances, how much really does need to be explained, because how much do we do, hopefully, out of consideration for other people? And I tell him sometimes, but he'll ask me, why do I need to say this? He says, well, because the other person needs to hear that. It'll make them feel good at that time. Whereas he would not necessarily do that extra little bit of social nuance. It's more of kind of a programmed thing. And those conversations have been extremely taxing at times for me, but also they've slowed me down. They've slowed me down in a good way. They're humbling. They bring you back to basics. Because what really we're speaking to, and when you're talking about, your children and so on, is how you guide innocence through reality.
Yes.
And my son has perfect innocence right now, even now. I don't, because through the autism, he doesn't know that people could harm him. He doesn't expect adverse reactions to his social behavior. And mercifully, he hasn't actually really received any adverse reactions yet. But I'm still waiting for that first bullying moment. I'm still waiting for him as an adult. Maybe he has a situation with law enforcement. We're working on things with communication impairment and law enforcement right now so that non-normal reactions to communication can be, better accounted for. But, we're guiding innocence through reality, and that's a really tough process.
It is tough. And I will say on your other favorite subject, I think that those parents that are trying to help their children that are autistic get access to things like career technical education, I think that it is not a dissimilar fight than what urban students have getting access. It's the same fight. Your child should have that access, that opportunity. And you have, how old is your son?
He's 11.
Yeah, so you're gonna get to this next step where the CTE programs are gonna say, because he's autistic, we're not real sure that we can provide him with the exposure to learning some trades. And what we found is that, autistic students can be helped to do a lot of things, from working in husbandry with animals to doing a lot of stuff in hospitality if they're given the opportunity and support. But I will tell you, it has been a very, very difficult fight opening up CTE programs in counties throughout the state to provide that opportunity, and very few do.
Yeah.
So, I'm just sharing this.
Yeah. No, I understand that, and there's definitely, we'll have another conversation on this too. But there's a momentum that may be lost if we're not careful on employer integration following COVID, because the reality is that employers are facing just to stay afloat.
Yes, that's right.
And
well, I'm only raising this, Ben, because it relates just to bias.
Yeah.
The presumption is you'll have a greater problem if you include this kind of student opportunity. And so that's the thing that many African Americans face every day. They're perceived as the problem even before one exists. You don't know whether it's a problem or not. And so it is very difficult to really explain it if you haven't lived it, but it happens, time and again. You don't have to think about what it means to be seated near the kitchen or near the restroom. But I do, because traditionally that's where they sat us. You don't have to tell your child, well, don't ever let them sit you by the restroom, or don't ever let them sit you by the kitchen. But we do. These are things that most Americans, they would just never even think about.
Yeah.
But when someone gets you and walks you all the way through the restaurant, all the way to a table that is near the kitchen or the restroom, and you pass empty tables all along the way. So, it's those kinds of nuances you wouldn't know, Ben, if somebody hadn't shared that with you. It's not something that is even in your worldview. It's not even a perception that you would have. And the hostess or host, where did they learn that from? They didn't walk in there 9 times out of 10. They learned it from someone at the restaurant. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes, certainly. And you would have a multi-generational family awareness of that scenario going back how many years? And
well, when my mother started in the legislature in 1972, there were no African Americans working at the state capitol other than in legislators' offices. There were none on either the Democratic or Republican policy or fiscal staffs in the House or Senate. No sergeants, none of that. The only time you saw a person of color was the actual member, and if they had a staffer within their offices. There were no persons of color in governmental affairs, in any lobbying organizations. There were none that served in those capacities in any state departments. I mean, that's 1972. When the Black Caucus Foundation was organized in 1983, it was specifically to address that issue. And fortunately, some forward-thinking people at the University of Michigan, Michigan State, agreed to provide students with 12 academic credits if they worked with the department on a policy idea with a member of the Michigan Legislative Black Caucus. And from that process, we began recruiting persons to work on staff. So Ron Russell was the first that came on board and went to fiscal. But I'm just sharing this with you. That it really hasn't been that long ago.
Right, right.
People presume it's always been that. It really hasn't been that long ago where you had staffers involved. And so what you worry about all the time is the how much we lose with term limits and how far off focus we get because we don't have staffers that come from a variety of backgrounds from around the state. I'll give you one funny story. In the 80s, you know, we used to spend a lot of time talking about our top economic sectors and what we should be investing in. And at the time, of course, we had manufacturing, agriculture, but our third sector was forestry and forestry products. And the reason I raise this now is I could not fathom that Michigan would be out of toilet paper and forestry products was our third largest sector in 1980. Can you?
Right.
But forestry products now, that's Oregon and Alaska. It's not Michigan anymore. How could that happen? Now, you're a more recent member than I am, but I would dare say that just as legislators have no idea what their top economic sectors are in Michigan, they have no idea how to solve the problems of urban America.
I think that's a good insight. I mean, what can you say to that? And this kind of gets into this vein of conversation that we were heading toward anyway, because the legislature often reflects societal challenges, and that goes right down to conduct. And we talked about the toxic environment. We talked about this slide from disagreement to assuming that someone that disagrees actually wants to harm you, and how that poisonous assumption is now a part of almost every interaction that we have. And it, you know, in the legislative side, you can have great relationships. You can have a lot of bipartisanship in relationships. I have a lot of friends on the other side of the aisle, but rarely does that really translate to that voting board or the policy itself. And people just kind of retreat to their corners. And so, in a broader context, I mean, for any topic that really is seeking to affect lasting change, you know, in this environment of hyper-partisanship and personal attacks, low engagement communication, like social media, what do you see as a path forward to effective advocacy?
Well, I really think that it's important, one, for members to focus on an end goal. So let's go to the topic that is near and dear to you, which is addressing, you know, some of the challenges related to a skilled workforce. The example that I'll give you, Ben, is that we invested an awful lot of time in training programs, but we did not make the same investment in understanding what employers actually need. And so my point is moving the system from a supply-based system, meaning we're training people based on what we think they should be learning, versus moving the system to demand, which says, let's take a scan of what our employers have in their current workforce, where their growth in sales is likely to be, how old their workforce is and who's aging out of it. And let's train to replace those workers and then train them for growth. Our workforce development system really needs to move to that direction. It makes all of the difference in the world. Imagine if there were legislators trained that way, to say, well, we began this process to rewrite how we pay for public education. And so we're going to make sure that, Ben, you and 5 of your colleagues are experts in understanding, how property taxes are levied and how those mills are used to support the current infrastructure in order to move the bar toward a virtual education that we know will have to be a big part of post-COVID-19. The end game is rarely where we focus. And so I think partisanship moves out of the window if people are focused more on the solution than the how-to. The how-to usually focuses on who controls the money.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd say so.
So who controls it and who it flows through? The end game focuses on where you really want to go. I think the employers have a very difficult time understanding how to work with members because they're so focused on debating the how-to instead of the end game.
Right.
I think we spend far too little time talking about the reality of where work is versus our aspirational goals of where we want work to be. And all of these things are the same things that affect issues related to resolving race. We have to deal with the realities before we move to aspirational. So the reality is, if everything I see on television is 10 times better than what I have in my house, the aspirational goals you set for me are meaningless. Is going to college meaningful to me versus being able to get a financial means to take care of my family today? What's going to have more value?
Right. Absolutely.
Right? And so I think sometimes we forget that most people are just trying to live decently.
Well, and that's a fair point. I coming from poverty, I have had to explain to other policymakers that you can have these broad goals for that family, but thinking back to my parents, this was the vision. It was getting through that week. It was being on the phone with social services, trying to get those meager benefits, hours on the telephone, wondering about the job, if you're going to have that job next week. Absolutely. And so you break into that. How do you break into that stressed, immediate, almost it's a fight or flight mindset when you get worn down? How you break into that with aspirations, that's a huge challenge.
It is. I don't want to sound like a pessimist because I'm not. I'm the eternal optimist. But I do think we have to be pragmatic about how we can take measured steps in any of these areas to solve some very, very difficult problems. I think many of them can be solved if we're not distracted. And I think that's our big challenge. It's always more fun to work on the shiny project.
We talked about shiny objects before we started recording today, so very timely.
I have to tell you, though, I am very optimistic that all of the attention that's being focused on equity fairness, and opportunity, that serious conversations will take place. I hope corporations just don't start throwing money at it without really thinking through how to solve some of the basic challenges. I also hope that the discussions about defunding the police don't derail what could be a very positive momentum.
And that's actually directly related to the question, which is, as you're talking, or you have an opportunity to interact with those who are advocating for change, what do you think is the most effective means that they could employ?
Well, I had a debate with a friend of mine, about this issue. And quite frankly, I told him that I believe it was a messaging error to say defund the police. And the reason I say that is because it's too easy for people to construe that as meaning you have citizens that aren't interested in any kind of public safety or law enforcement. So I always say the minute you have to start explaining what you mean, you have a problem with your message.
No question. No question. We've done the political game long enough, both of us, to know that.
Right.
But when you also had that, the combination of that, though, with some rather, I don't know, I hesitate, I'm trying to find the right word, maybe knee-jerk is the right phrase, but you see some of these decisions made that we're going to actually do a direct cut or layoffs, and it tied into that narrative in the general public's mind, because these were decisions that were made without really any context. And
I agree. I call that hijacking the objective. And so that worries me. I'm just being very candid with you. Sure, this discussion of demilitarizing public safety, that is a rational discussion that can be had. How many tanks do we really need? How many armor-piercing bullets do we really? That's a separate discussion. The fundamental discussion, though, Ben, is what we talked about earlier. Are we really serving or policing? They're two very, very different objectives. A public safety person's working hard to know the kids, families in the neighborhood. Now, granted, there are going to be some areas that are just violent, where you're going to have officers that are going to have to be more guarded. And so that kind of challenge for law enforcement should not be broad brushed for every person of color, just because the predominant number of people that live in that challenged community are more aggressive. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yeah. We have to be able to have a distinction into where there's a real issue or where we're making issues. But, in my reality, even in the poorest and most troubled cities in America, if law enforcement wants to ease into that process and identify the bad actors in order to arrest them, they can do that without serious disruption to the rest of the community. You don't have to browbeat them. And so I really am a person that says, one, we don't pay officers enough. That's one. Two, if we pay them, we should expect for them to be culturally competent. Those are two issues. If they don't have the ability to serve every citizen, and I put that service in quotations, they can't be humiliated by serving a person of color or a person that's of another ethnicity, creed. That should never embarrass you if you're a public servant. If you can't do it earnestly and treat all people with dignity, it's probably not the job for you. Personally, Dr. Alvin Poussant wrote a wonderful paper on what he called extreme racism as a mental health disorder. And he characterized that as the person that initially starts with antagonism, and then they move from antagonism to separation, and then beyond that, then they move to direct discrimination, which usually results in some kind of direct harm, be it verbal or physical. And the American Association of Psychiatrists have said, racism is so deeply embedded in the American culture that we don't see it as a pathology, we see it as part of the culture. Now, how heavy is that? But it's because implicit bias is passed on in a form, family to family. But the minute we're able to take the extremists out of that process, I think the stigmatism that some blacks have of all whites being racist, I think that goes away. Right now, there's no way to distinguish it. So the presumption is, you know, maybe most white people feel this way. I really was very, very encouraged to see, you know, so many young people of all colors and creeds taking up the mantle of trying to address the current injustice. We just haven't had that kind of broad-based interest in the past. Not energized interest where people would take direct action. So that gives me a lot of hope, Ben. I'll be real candid with you. I think this is decisively different than some of the other movements that have occurred, you know, in the past. Haven't seen this since maybe 69 or 71.
Yeah, and I agree with you that there's definitely the potential for some things that would really be reformative just across the country. And so some of the line of questioning really is from the standpoint of how to make sure that that tremendous energy and opportunity is responsibly able to be you know, realized, because we've seen things derailed. We've seen narratives defined by extremes. We've seen folks who exploit energies for their own purposes in the past on any number of subjects. This one certainly is no exception. And ways to kind of look at those things in advance from some of the past experiences. How do you avoid some of those pitfalls on some realistic goals really having a chance to be met in this moment versus things that just allow it to kind of fade and then, or worse, kind of hollow things that are then pointed to as, okay, that was done, so I guess we're okay, you know, that kind of thing. Hopefully I'm making sense here, but I've just seen that happen.
You do, and I worry about the same thing. Okay, so we have an opportunity to voice our concerns. The business community throws some money at it. There's a conviction or two. It's over.
Yeah,
it's over.
Before I forget, because I wanted to mention this before, you mentioned corporations. Corporations are awful arbiters of culture, cultural and morality.
Yes.
Absolutely reactive, absolutely considering the base of their customers. They are not standard bearers for social action.
That's right.
So I don't know why so much is weighed there, but whether there's some CEO announcement or something, that to me doesn't mean anything, because that's
you're absolutely right.
You know.
Well, you asked me things that, you know, I see that can be immediately done. So there is a policy that was piloted on the maintenance of the Southfield Freeway. The U.S. Department of Federal Highway gave MDOT the capability to draft the RFP using best value as one of the weighted criteria. And best value meant the winning bidder would not only have to have the technological capability and skill set, financial wherewithal, and competitive price, but in their bid, they also would have to submit a plan on how they would hire the workforce from that local community. They also had to submit a plan on how much or how they would spend during the course of that project in the local community in order to make sure the best value was achieved by the state in driving economics in the community where the project was slated. The winning vendor, and we thought we were going to end up in federal court over this because, of course, people were complaining that, you know, that was not fair and it would drive the cost of the contract up. But, you know, I always say, you know, when you do good things, the Lord, you know, pushes you a little bit further. So in this instance, the lowest bidder also was the one with the most aggressive local development plan. And they came up with a plan that would allow for them to hire skilled craftsmen by zip code that was contiguous to the highway. So they sought craftsmen first that lived near where the project was. Two, they had a number of innovative things like buying gas cards from all the gas stations along the route to the freeway. Mm-hmm. So anyone working on the project, they wanted them to fill up at these stations. Buying restaurant cards where the workers could eat lunch at restaurants along the Southfield Freeway. Well, you automatically know no vendor is going to include anything like that in a bid unless they have an incentive to do so. We believe that through implementation of best value as a concept in procurement, the race issue and local issue goes away. If you're in a community like Flint or Detroit, you're going to have diverse workers because they live there. Right. Right. Right? If you have work up in the UP, you're going to have people from the UP working on the project. Yes. Because it's an incentive for the contractor to hire locally. They're not going to bring people from West Michigan or Southeastern Michigan up to the UP. They can find them up there and help win the bid. They're going to do that. And so we believe there are ways to address issues related to local economic development, diverse hiring, just by taking the time to be a little thoughtful and codifying those policies after you test them into formalized procurement practices, both in the public and private sector. So that's just one example. Things that we can do. Yeah. I mean, you solve the economic and social issues by providing platforms for opportunity. Platforms for opportunity that do not disenfranchise others, but provide a fair opportunity for those that are most affected to participate. So wherever we're vesting taxpayer money, give that community the opportunity to participate. You don't have to require it if you create an incentive for those participating in the project to do it on their own. Why require it? Business people are innovative, they're smart, let them do what they do. Right. And we'll get the participation. Well, that's one of my quick examples.
No, and it's a good one because I've enjoyed, you know, overall you've had a very strong focus in your career on economic mobility as a catalyst for community advancement. And it's not often talked about in that terms. It's always coming after the devastation of problems with social interventions when perhaps that economic mobility and the overall prosperity of that community growing and those opportunities would then mitigate to some extent those social ills, if you will, you know, or at least create a basis for more sustained service delivery, you know, as the tax base gets to be more prosperous, as people are supporting their families and so on. And that's scalable to any community size. I don't care if that's urban challenges or rural. We've got the same challenges with economic advancement and wages and things of that nature, but you got to have that local focus for sure. And I've learned over the years, it's funny you're talking about bids. Certainly the lowest bid isn't always the best bid.
That's right.
And if anybody thinks that's the case, they haven't probably been through a process of ripping up sidewalks that had to be repoured, or finding out just how little value perhaps you got out of that road repaved. But as someone coming from local government, I'm definitely wary of those scenarios. We need to dig a little bit deeper on that. But I wanted to, we're getting to the end of our hour here, and I wanted to throw something out to you that's a scenario that I think is important to ask a lot of people, depending on, or regardless of what their background is. And I guess as you're in the community, if you had a brief amount of time to interact with a youth in Detroit, and you only had a couple minutes maybe to interact with them and advise them, you had an open ear, what would you share with that youth?
Well, the short answer is stay on the path. The path is straight, meaning that if you do those things that you know are going to provide you with a trajectory that's forward or upward, you're going to be successful. And so anything else is noise, or anything that represents noise is going to take you off of your trajectory. And so if someone tells you that you shouldn't go to class and you shouldn't be on time, you already know that's a distraction. You have to resist it. It's the same thing that their parents probably tell them that they don't want to listen to, is that, you know, the fable of the tortoise and the hare is really true. There's a lot to be said for patience. There's a lot to be said for consistency. I always tell them, and be drug-free. Even in this environment of normalizing marijuana, I will still say it's a trap. And you need to keep a clear mind, to keep a clear focus. And if you keep a clear focus, you'll visualize where you want to be. Visualize where you want to be 20 years from now. And when you see it, then put the work in to make it happen. And I'm a strong believer in visualization. If you understand what you want your career to look like, if you understand what you want your home to look like, you set those goals, you set those values, you understand the kind of spouse and partnership you want. You set those goals, you set those standards, and you don't have to deviate from them. You have to be patient. Be patient, be consistent, and it will happen. So that's my elevator speech.
Yeah, elevator speech question. I'm gonna start calling it that. And you know, you're a blessed man. You know.
I am thankful and humbled every day, Ben. I take nothing for granted. I've had, you know, challenges like any other human, but I've been blessed with the opportunity to serve. And I will say this: I've learned that you can do good and do very well. And you can do well by doing good. And if you do good, you will always do better. So when people get on this mantra that they're chasing money and they believe that's, you know, you got to chase the opportunity, what I will slow them down and say, the money will come if you do good. The other thing that is important, lift others as you rise. Take time to lift other people as you grow. You can't do all of this by yourself, and sharing time, information, and investing in others, that's a big part of it. But no, the Lord has blessed me. I'm not gonna, I have a wonderful wife, wonderful kids. When I retired 3 years ago, I left and went to Hong Kong for 2 months with my wife. That was the only way she was convinced I would unplug.
And you started to build up something in Hong Kong, I'm sure.
Well, we got back. When we got back, then Harrison was on the way. So
Yeah.
I said, the Lord has a sense of humor.
Yeah.
You think you're gonna stop, but not really.
That's right. That's right. Well, this is a pleasure, KB. I want to say thank you for joining me for a conversation. The first of a series. We're gonna come back and we're gonna do some more segments on that concept of economic mobility as a cultural catalyst, community catalyst. We're gonna talk about vocational education, and we're gonna.
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't tell your viewers that the city of Detroit had not had a career technical school for 20 years, and as crazy as that sounds, there really was not a will to invest in it because of the stigma associated with skilled instruction as something that was less than traditional academic pursuits. That's where you sent the non-academic performers
Right.
to career tech or vocational education. But if it had not been for persons like you, Ben, that took the time, and I really want to say this, took the time to really understand the nexus between investment in citizens that might have the capability to rebuild their own communities while also being gainfully employed to help the local and state economy, we never would have gotten a re-envisioned Randolph Career Technical Center. So from the bottom of my heart, I thank you. I think the state is blessed to have a young man like Jeff Donofrio. I was sad to see him leave the city of Detroit, but happy to see him go to the state because just that path of trying to create partnership between elected officials and policymakers, our business community, and then those persons that really understood the importance of having both the access to union opportunities, but also craft opportunities that aren't union in order to make a community viable. We never would have been successful in creating that new facility had it not been for people like you. So bottom of my heart, man, I really, really, really thank you.
Oh, it was a pleasure, and more collaboration on the way. I know it's exciting to see. I enjoy every visit to Detroit and seeing the tremendous changes there. We'll do a conversation about all things Detroit too, because there's an amazing story happening there as well. So this is the Ben Asks interview series. We were talking with Dr. KB Stallworth, the first of what I hope will be a series of conversations. He is the public policy expert emeritus for both the Black Caucus Foundation of Michigan and the Michigan Legislative Black Caucus. KB, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ben. Have a good evening.
You too.
Goodbye, everyone.